Welcome back to No Sleep Historian, where we dig deep into the dark corners of history that your textbooks never told you about. I'm your host, and if you're here, you're probably like me, someone who can't sleep because you're haunted by the real stories of the past. Tonight, we're trading fairy tales for facts, romance for reality, and stepping through the portcullis into the truth about medieval castle life. Forget everything Disney taught you. Forget the gleaming towers and beautiful princesses. Tonight, we're talking about lice, latrines, and the stench of noble living. We're exploring what it really meant to live behind those towering walls, and why you wouldn't want to trade places with anyone who did. This is a 10-part series that will take you from the Great Hall to the guardrobe, from the servants' quarters to the chapel, revealing the brutal reality of castle life that history has carefully sanitized. So grab your headphones, turn off the lights, and prepare to discover why living in a medieval castle was more nightmare than dream. The castle. For most of us, the word conjures images of fairy tale romance, knights in shining armor, beautiful princesses in flowing gowns, grand feasts with endless wine and music. Hollywood has fed us this fantasy for decades, and even our history books seem to skip over the uglier details of medieval life. But here's the thing about castles. They weren't built for comfort. They weren't designed for happiness. They were fortresses, prisons, and power centers, all rolled into one massive stone structure. And the people who lived inside them, from the mightiest lord to the lowest scullery maid, were trapped in a world of violence, disease, paranoia, and survival. Over the next 10 episodes, we're going to peel back the layers of medieval myth and expose the raw truth of castle life. We'll explore how these stone giants functioned as complete societies, cut off from the outside world and governed by their own brutal rules. We'll meet the people who inhabited these walls, not the romanticized figures of legend, but real human beings struggling with hunger, cold, fear, and the constant threat of death. Each episode will take you deeper into a different aspect of castle life, from the politics of the Great Hall to the horror of the dungeons, from the desperate scramble for survival during a siege to the superstitions that governed every aspect of daily life. By the end of this series, you'll understand why the Middle Ages were called the Dark Ages, and why living in a castle was often a fate worse than death. So let's begin our journey into the shadows of history, where the walls have ears and the stones remember everything. Part 1. The castle walls close in. Picture this. You're transported back to 1347, and you find yourself standing before the massive gates of Warwick Castle. The limestone walls tower above you, 60 feet high and 12 feet thick. The portcullis drops with a thunderous crash, and you realize something that would chill you to the bone. You're not entering a palace. You're entering a prison where the bars are made of stone, and everyone inside is serving a life sentence. The medieval castle wasn't a home in any sense we'd recognize today. It was a military installation, a government center, a prison, a church, and a small city, all crammed into one defensible space. And unlike the movies, it wasn't spacious. Most castles were cramped, overcrowded, and suffocating. The average castle might house anywhere from 50 to 300 people, all living on top of each other in a space smaller than a modern shopping mall. Let's talk about who actually lived in these stone fortresses. At the top of the hierarchy sat the Lord. But don't imagine some benevolent king from a fairy tale. This was a man who had clawed his way to power through violence, cunning, and often sheer brutality. He owned everything and everyone within those walls. His word was law, and his justice was swift and merciless. The Lord's quarters, the solar, might have been the most comfortable rooms in the castle, but even they were cold, damp, and barely furnished by modern standards. The Lord's family lived in constant fear, not just of external enemies, but of each other. Medieval nobility was a cutthroat world where brothers murdered brothers for inheritance, where wives were disposed of for failing to produce male heirs, and where children were married off as political pawns before they could even walk properly. The lady of the castle might have worn fine clothes, but she was essentially a high-class prisoner, valuable only for her ability to forge political alliances and bear sons. Below the noble family came the household knights, professional soldiers who had sworn loyalty to the Lord in exchange for room, board, and the promise of plunder. These weren't the chivalrous knights of romance. They were hardened killers who maintained order through fear and violence. They slept in the barracks, ate in the great hall, and spent their days training for war or enforcing the Lord's will upon the local population. The castle's administrative staff, the steward, the marshal, the chamberlain, formed a small but crucial group. These were the men who actually ran the day-to-day operations, managing supplies, collecting taxes, and handling the Lord's business affairs. They were literate in an age when most people couldn't read their own names, which made them both valuable and dangerous. They knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively, and they often met suspicious ends when they knew too much. Then came the servants, and here's where the real horror begins. The castle's workforce was made up of dozens of people living in conditions that would make a modern prison seem luxurious. The kitchen staff worked 18-hour days in sweltering conditions, constantly at risk of burns, cuts, and food poisoning. The stable hands lived with the horses, often sleeping in the same stalls as the animals they tended. The washerwomen spent their days scrubbing clothes in freezing water, their hands cracked and bleeding from the harsh soap made from animal fat and lye. But perhaps the most tragic figures were the castle's children. Noble children were raised to be weapons in the ongoing war for power and survival. Boys were sent away at age 7 to serve as pages in other castles, learning to fight, to kill, and to suppress any hint of weakness or emotion. Girls were groomed from birth to be political assets, their marriages arranged before they could walk. Their worth measured entirely by their potential to produce male heirs. The children of servants fared even worse. They were put to work as soon as they could walk, carrying water, cleaning floors, and performing whatever tasks their small hands could manage. Child mortality was so high that many weren't even given names until they survived their first year. Those who lived to adulthood often bore the physical and psychological scars of their childhood labor. The castle's physical layout reflected this rigid social hierarchy. The higher your status, the higher up you lived. Literally, the Lord's family occupied the top floors of the keep, while servants slept in basement chambers or in the spaces between walls. Privacy was non-existent for everyone but the Lord himself. Most people slept several to a bed, and even the noble family's quarters were constantly invaded by servants, guards, and petitioners. The walls that protected the castle also trapped its inhabitants. Leaving required permission, and permission was rarely granted. The outside world was considered hostile territory, full of bandits, enemy armies, and plague-carrying travelers. But staying inside meant accepting a life of rigid routine, constant surveillance, and absolute submission to the Lord's will. The castle's daily routine was governed by the bells of the chapel. Everyone rose before dawn, attended morning prayers, and then began their assigned tasks. There was no weekend, no vacation, no concept of leisure time for anyone but the nobility. Work continued from dawn to dusk, broken only by brief meal periods and evening prayers. The routine was the same day after day, year after year, until death finally provided release. What made this existence even more unbearable was the knowledge that it was permanent. Social mobility was virtually impossible. A servant's child would be a servant, a knight's son would be a knight, and a lord's daughter would be a political pawn. The walls of the castle weren't just physical barriers, they were the boundaries of entire lives, marking the limits of hope and possibility. The irony is that these stone prisons were built to protect their inhabitants from the dangers of the outside world. But in creating these fortresses, medieval society had simply traded one set of horrors for another. Instead of facing the uncertainty of the open road, castle dwellers faced the certainty of a lifetime trapped within. Walls that grew smaller and more oppressive with each passing day. As we'll explore in the coming episodes, every aspect of castle life was designed to maintain control, preserve hierarchy, and suppress the basic human desires for freedom, dignity, and choice. The castle wasn't a palace, it was a perfectly designed machine for turning human beings into cogs in a system that valued only power, violence, and survival. So the next time you see a castle in a movie or a fairy tale, remember what we've learned tonight. Behind those majestic walls lived real people whose lives were measured not in happiness or fulfillment, but in their ability to endure another day in their stone prison. The walls that rose to protect them had become the bars of their cage, and escape was not just impossible, it was unthinkable. Part 2. The Great Hall's Hunger. The Great Hall. In every castle movie, it's the same scene. Long tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, golden chalices brimming with wine, and jolly nobles tearing into turkey legs while minstrels play cheerful tunes. It's the medieval equivalent of a luxury restaurant, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. The Great Hall was the beating heart of castle life, but it was also where the brutal realities of medieval existence were most visible. It was where the hierarchy was displayed, where power was exercised, and where the difference between life and death often came down to where you sat at the table. Let's start with the hall itself. Picture a cavernous stone chamber, maybe 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. The walls were bare stone, maybe decorated with a few tapestries, if the lord was wealthy, but more often adorned with weapons, shields, and the occasional severed head of an enemy. The floor was covered with rushes, basically medieval carpeting, made from reeds and straw that was supposed to absorb spills and waste. But here's what the movies never show you. Those rushes were rarely changed. They became repositories for food scraps, spilled wine, vomit, urine, and worse. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting food, human waste, and the smoke from the central hearth that had no proper chimney. Visitors to medieval castles often wrote about the stench being so powerful it made them physically ill. The hearth dominated one end of the hall, a massive stone fireplace that was supposed to heat the entire space. It didn't. The hall was perpetually cold, with temperatures that rarely rose above freezing in winter. The fire produced more smoke than heat, and the smoke had nowhere to go except through a hole in the roof, when there was one. Most of the time, the hall was filled with a choking haze that made breathing difficult and stung the eyes. Now, about those legendary feasts, yes, they happened, but they were rare, expensive, and politically motivated displays of power rather than celebrations of abundance. A major feast might occur a few times a year during religious holidays to celebrate a military victory or to impress visiting dignitaries. The rest of the time, meals in the Great Hall were exercises in survival and hierarchy. The seating arrangement in the hall wasn't random. It was a carefully orchestrated display of social rank. The Lord and his family sat at the high table on a raised platform at one end of the hall. This wasn't just about ceremony, it was practical. The high table was closest to the fire, farthest from the drafty doors, and positioned so the Lord could survey everyone in the hall, while making it difficult for potential assassins to approach unseen. Below the high table, literally and figuratively, sat everyone else. Knights and household officials occupied the tables closest to the Lord, while servants, soldiers, and visitors sat progressively farther away. The distance from the high table directly correlated with the quality and quantity of food you received. Speaking of food, let's destroy another myth. The idea that medieval people ate enormous quantities of meat is largely fantasy. Yes, the Lord's table might feature roasted venison, fowl, and beef, but this was a display of wealth and power, not a regular occurrence. Most of the time, even the nobility subsisted on a diet that would shock modern audiences. The staple food for everyone, from lord to servant, was bread. But not the fluffy white bread we know today. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often made from a mixture of grains that included barley, oats, and rye. The quality of your bread indicated your social status. White bread made from wheat flour was reserved for the Lord's table, while servants ate bread so dark and coarse it was barely edible. For the lower classes, bread often doubled as a plate. These trenchers were thick slices of stale bread that soaked up the juices from whatever food was placed on top. After the meal, the trenchers were either eaten by the diner or thrown to the dogs. Waste not, want not. Meat, when available, was usually preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Fresh meat was a luxury that only appeared during hunting season or when livestock was slaughtered before winter. Most meat dishes were actually gruels or stews made from bones, scraps, and whatever vegetables could be found. The famous bone broth wasn't a trendy health food. It was often the only source of protein available during the lean months. Vegetables were considered peasant food beneath the dignity of the nobility. This wasn't just snobbery, it was a nutritional disaster. The medieval diet was severely lacking in vitamins, leading to diseases like scurvy, rickets, and night blindness. The pale, gaunt appearance we associate with medieval art wasn't an artistic choice, it was malnutrition. The drinking situation was equally grim. Water was considered unsafe to drink, and often it was. Wells were frequently contaminated with human waste, and clean water sources were rare. Instead, everyone drank ale, wine, or mead. But don't imagine high-quality beverages. Most castle ale was weak, sour, and often contaminated. Wine was expensive and usually watered down. Even children drank alcohol because it was safer than water. The kitchen that produced these meals was a nightmare of its own. Located in a separate building to prevent fires from spreading to the main castle, the kitchen was a hellscape of open flames, boiling cauldrons, and primitive tools. The head cook, usually a man, wielded absolute authority over a staff of assistants, scullery maids, and kitchen boys. The work was dangerous, with frequent burns, cuts, and accidents involving heavy equipment. Food preparation was a constant battle against spoilage and contamination. Without refrigeration, meat began rotting within hours of slaughter. Spices weren't used to enhance flavor. They were used to mask the taste of decay. The wealthy could afford imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg. But even these couldn't always overcome the reality of rancid meat and sour milk. The serving of meals was itself a complex ritual that reinforced social hierarchy. Food was brought to the hall by servants who had to follow strict protocols about who was served first, how much they received, and in what order. The Lord was always served first, followed by his family, then guests, then household officers, and finally the common servants. By the time food reached the lower tables, it was often cold, limited in quantity, and of poor quality. Famine was a constant threat that haunted every castle. A failed harvest, a siege, or a harsh winter could quickly deplete food stores. During famines, the social hierarchy became even more pronounced. The Lord's family continued to eat relatively well while servants starved. There are records of castle servants dying of malnutrition while their lords maintained their elaborate dining rituals. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of castle dining was how it was used as a tool of control. The Lord literally held the power of life and death over his household through his control of food distribution. Servants who displeased him might find their rations cut or eliminated entirely. Political prisoners were often starved into submission. The Great Hall wasn't just a dining room, it was a theater where power was displayed and enforced through the basic human need for sustenance. The cleanup after meals was another horror entirely. The rush-covered floors were littered with bones, scraps, and spilled food. Dogs roamed freely through the hall, fighting over scraps and leaving their own waste behind. The smell of decomposing food, mixed with animal waste, created an atmosphere so foul that even contemporary writers commented on it. Table manners, when they existed at all, were primitive by modern standards. People ate with their hands, knives, and occasionally wooden spoons. Forks wouldn't appear in Europe for several more centuries. Diners wiped their hands on their clothes, the tablecloth, or whatever was convenient. The idea of individual plates was foreign. Most people ate from communal bowls or directly from the table surface. The Great Hall's role in castle life extended far beyond meals. It was the courtroom where justice was dispensed, the meeting place where political decisions were made, and the sleeping quarters for many of the castle's inhabitants. After the evening meal, the tables would be cleared away, and servants would spread their bedding on the floor, sleeping among the food scraps and filth. So the next time you see a medieval feast seen in a movie, remember what we've learned tonight. Behind the flickering candlelight and the seeming abundance lay a harsh reality of hierarchy, hunger, and survival. The Great Hall wasn't a place of celebration. It was a daily reminder that in the medieval world, your worth was measured by your access to food, and your position at the table determined whether you lived or died. The walls of the Great Hall witnessed countless displays of power, numerous acts of cruelty, and the slow starvation of those deemed unworthy of sustenance. Every meal was a performance, every bite a privilege, and every empty stomach a reminder of how precarious life could be within those stone walls. Part 3. Cold stones and empty beds. When you think of a medieval bedroom, you probably picture something from a period drama. A massive four-poster bed with heavy curtains, maybe a roaring fireplace, and certainly some semblance of privacy and comfort. But if you were transported back to a medieval castle and told to find your sleeping quarters, you'd quickly discover that comfort was a luxury most people couldn't even imagine, let alone afford. Let's start with the brutal truth. Most people in a medieval castle didn't have bedrooms. They had sleeping spaces, and those spaces were shared, cold, and often indistinguishable from storage areas or workrooms. The concept of a private bedroom was reserved for the lord and his immediate family, and even their accommodations would be considered primitive by modern standards. The lord's chamber, the solar, was usually located on the upper floor of the keep, both for security and to escape the worst of the ground-level dampness. But don't imagine a spacious master suite. Most solars were cramped rooms, maybe 12 feet by 15 feet, with stone walls that wept moisture and wooden floors that creaked ominously underfoot. The walls were bare stone, sometimes covered with tapestries that served more as insulation than decoration. The lord's bed was indeed large and impressive, but it was also a piece of furniture that served multiple purposes. It was a status symbol, a private meeting place, and often the warmest spot in the entire castle. The bed was essentially a wooden platform with a straw mattress covered by whatever fabric the lord could afford. The famous four-poster beds with their heavy curtains weren't just decorative. They were essential for privacy and warmth in a room where servants came and went freely and where the temperature rarely rose above freezing. But here's what really challenges our modern sensibilities. The lord and his wife rarely slept alone. Their bed was often shared with children, visiting dignitaries, trusted servants, and sometimes even favored dogs. Privacy was a foreign concept, and the idea of a romantic private bedroom was centuries away from being invented. The other members of the noble family had even less comfort. The lord's children might have their own beds, but these were usually simple wooden frames with straw mattresses located in chambers that were little more than closets. Noble daughters often shared beds with their servants or companions, while younger sons might sleep in the great hall with the household knights. Speaking of the household knights, these professional warriors had sleeping arrangements that would horrify modern soldiers. They slept in the barracks, which were usually long, narrow rooms lined with simple wooden beds, or, more commonly, with straw pallets laid directly on the stone floor. A dozen or more men might sleep in a single room with no privacy, no personal storage, and no heat except what little warmth their bodies could generate. The servants had it worse. Most slept wherever they could find space, in the kitchens near the ovens for warmth, in the stables with the animals, or on the floors of the great hall after the evening meal. The lucky ones might have a simple straw pallet, but many slept directly on the stone floors, with nothing but their clothes for warmth and comfort. The chambermaid, despite her name, rarely had a chamber of her own. She slept in the ladies' room, on a small bed or pallet at the foot of her mistress's bed, ready to respond to any need during the night. The kitchen staff often slept in the kitchen, huddled around the dying embers of the cooking fires, because it was the only warm place in the castle. Now let's talk about those beds themselves. The medieval mattress was a far cry from anything we'd recognize today. The finest mattresses were stuffed with down from geese or ducks, but these were incredibly expensive and rare. Most people slept on mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, or even moss and leaves. These mattresses were breeding grounds for insects, mice, and various parasites. The straw in mattresses had to be changed regularly, but regularly in medieval terms meant every few months at best. Old straw would become compressed, moldy, and infested with vermin. The smell of a medieval mattress was a combination of human sweat, animal dung, and the musty odor of decomposing organic matter. Bedding was equally primitive. Sheets, when they existed, were made from coarse linen or hemp. They were rough, scratchy, and rarely washed. Most people slept directly on the mattress, with their clothes on, covered by wool blankets that were thick and warm, but also heavy, scratchy, and often infested with lice and fleas. The concept of changing into special sleeping clothes was unknown. People slept in their day clothes, which meant that their beds accumulated all the dirt, sweat, and grime of daily life. The wealthy might have special sleeping gowns, but these were usually just lighter versions of their regular clothing, not the comfortable pajamas we know today. Hygiene in medieval bedrooms was almost non-existent. There was no running water, no soap, and no understanding of germs or bacteria. People might wash their hands and faces occasionally, but full-body bathing was rare and often considered unhealthy. The wealthy might bathe a few times a year, usually in a wooden tub filled with water that had been heated over the fire and carried up to their chambers. The bathroom situation was particularly grim. Most castles had garderobes, essentially holes in the wall that dropped waste into a pit or moat below. These were usually located in small chambers adjacent to the living quarters, and they were shared by multiple people. There was no toilet paper. People used rags, moss, or whatever was available. The smell was overwhelming, and the garderobes were breeding grounds for disease. For most people, nighttime elimination meant using chamber pots, pottery vessels that were kept under beds or in corners of rooms. These pots were emptied in the morning by servants, but the smell lingered in the sleeping quarters. The contents were usually thrown into the castle's waste pit, or, in some cases, simply tossed out the window into the courtyard below. The darkness in medieval bedrooms was absolute. There were no electric lights, no gas lamps, and candles were expensive luxuries. Most people went to bed when the sun set and rose when it came up. The wealthy might have a few candles or oil lamps, but these were fire hazards in rooms filled with straw and wooden furniture. The cold was perhaps the worst aspect of medieval sleeping arrangements. Castle walls were thick, but they provided little insulation. Windows were small and often just holes in the wall with wooden shutters. Glass was incredibly expensive and rare. The temperature inside a castle was usually only slightly warmer than outside, which meant that people often went to bed in temperatures that would be considered dangerously cold today. People dealt with the cold by sleeping in their clothes, piling on multiple blankets, and sometimes sharing beds with multiple people or even animals. It wasn't uncommon for servants to sleep with dogs or cats for warmth. The wealthy might have bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals that were placed in the bed before sleep. But these were fire hazards that sometimes led to fatal accidents. The noise in medieval sleeping quarters was constant. Stone walls echoed every sound, from snoring and coughing to the scurrying of rats and mice. The servants who slept in the great hall had to endure the sounds of dozens of other people, plus the dogs that roamed freely through the castle. Privacy and quiet were unknown luxuries. Disease spread rapidly in these crowded, unsanitary conditions. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were constant companions. Skin diseases, respiratory infections, and digestive problems were common. The shared sleeping arrangements meant that illness spread quickly through the entire household. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other respiratory diseases were common killers, particularly in the cold, damp conditions of castle bedrooms. The morning routine was similarly primitive. People woke up cold, stiff, and often ill. There was no hot shower, no bathroom sink, no comfortable place to dress. The wealthy might have a basin of water brought to their room by a servant, but this was often ice-coiled and shared by multiple people. For women, the challenges were even greater. Menstruation was managed with rags that were washed and reused, if they were washed at all. Childbirth took place in these same cold, unsanitary conditions, with no medical care beyond the help of other women who had learned through experience rather than training. The psychological toll of these living conditions was enormous. The lack of privacy, comfort, and basic hygiene created a constant state of stress and discomfort. People lived in a perpetual state of physical discomfort that would be considered torture by modern standards. When we look at medieval art and literature, we see romanticized versions of castle life that bear little resemblance to reality. The beautiful bedchambers depicted in illuminated manuscripts were fantasies, not reflections of actual living conditions. The reality was cold stone, vermin-infested straw, and the constant struggle to stay warm and dry. The sleeping arrangements in medieval castles were designed around survival, not comfort. Every aspect of bedtime, from the shared sleeping spaces to the primitive bedding, reflected the harsh realities of medieval life. People didn't go to bed to rest and rejuvenate. They went to bed to survive another night in conditions that would challenge the hardiest modern survivalist. So the next time you complain about your mattress being too soft or your room being too warm, remember the medieval castle dwellers who considered it a luxury to have a roof over their heads and a handful of straw to sleep on. Their bedrooms weren't sanctuaries. They were just another reminder of how brutal and uncomfortable life could be within those stone walls. Part 4. Filth beneath the flag. We need to talk about something that every castle movie conveniently ignores: the smell. If you could travel back in time to any medieval castle, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the sight of the impressive architecture or the sound of clashing swords. It would be the stench, an overwhelming combination of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and death that would make you physically ill within minutes. Medieval castles were, quite literally, cesspits of filth. The romantic image of noble knights and beautiful ladies living in pristine stone palaces is one of history's greatest lies. These people lived in conditions that would make a modern sewage treatment plant seem like a spa. Let's start with the most basic human need: waste disposal. The medieval solution was the garderobe, a name that literally means to guard the robe. These weren't bathrooms as we understand them. They were small chambers built into the castle walls with a simple hole that dropped waste directly into a pit below, or, in some cases, into the moat surrounding the castle. You make your way to a tiny stone chamber, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, with a wooden seat over a hole in the floor. There's no privacy. The door is often just a curtain. There's no toilet paper. You use whatever's available: moss, leaves, scraps of cloth, or sometimes just your hand. The smell is overwhelming because you're sitting directly over a pit that contains the waste of dozens of people, accumulated over months or years. The garderobe was often built into the outer wall of the castle, which meant that waste fell directly into the moat or onto the ground outside. This created a toxic environment around the castle that bred disease and attracted rats, flies, and other vermin. The famous moats that we think of as defensive features were often nothing more than open sewers filled with human waste, dead animals, and rotting garbage. A single guardrobe might serve 10 or 20 residents, and there was no schedule or privacy. You might find yourself waiting in line with other people, all of you trying to ignore the unbearable stench and the sounds coming from inside the tiny chamber. The wealthy had slightly better arrangements. The lord's family might have a private garderobe, but even this was just a hole in the wall that dropped waste into the same pit as everyone else's. Some castles had multiple garderobes, but they all faced the same basic problems: no sanitation, no privacy, and no way to properly dispose of waste. For the servants and common people, the situation was even worse. Many castles had communal latrines, long stone benches with multiple holes where several people could relieve themselves simultaneously. These were usually located in the most undesirable parts of the castle, often in basements or outbuildings, and they were rarely cleaned or maintained. The job of cleaning the latrines fell to the lowest servants, the gong, farmers, or rakers, who were paid extra for their willingness to do work that was considered beneath even the most desperate people. These workers had to climb down into the pits and physically remove the accumulated waste, often by hand. The smell from these waste pits permeated the entire castle. The stone walls absorbed the odors, and the medieval understanding of ventilation was primitive at best. The stench was so overwhelming that visitors often commented on it in their writings. Foreign diplomats wrote about being unable to eat or sleep due to the smell in English and French castles. But human waste was just one component of the castle's overall filth problem. Personal hygiene was virtually unknown. People rarely bathed, and when they did, it was considered a special occasion. The wealthy might bathe a few times a year, usually in a wooden tub filled with water that had been heated over the fire. But this water was often shared by multiple people, and there was no soap as we know it, just harsh lye made from animal fat and ash. Most people never bathed at all. They might wash their hands and faces occasionally, but full body washing was rare and often considered unhealthy. Medieval medical theory held that bathing opened the pores and made people vulnerable to disease. The result was that people lived their entire lives accumulating layers of dirt, sweat, and grime. The clothing situation made things worse. People owned very few clothes, often just 1 or 2 outfits, and these were rarely washed. Washing clothes was a labor-intensive process that required hauling water, heating it over a fire, and using harsh soap that often damaged the fabric. Most people wore the same clothes for weeks or months at a time, and these clothes absorbed all the smells and stains of daily life. Undergarments were virtually unknown. People wore their outer clothes directly against their skin, which meant that body odor, sweat, and other secretions soaked into the fabric and stayed there. The wealthy might have linen undergarments, but these were also rarely washed and were often shared by multiple people. The lice situation was a nightmare that haunted everyone from the lowest servant to the highest noble. These parasites thrived in the warm, unwashed conditions of medieval clothing and bedding. Everyone had lice. It was considered a normal part of life. People spent hours each day picking lice and nits from their hair and clothes, and specialized combs were among the most common personal possessions. But lice weren't just annoying, they were dangerous. They carried typhus, a disease that killed thousands of people in medieval Europe. The connection between lice and disease wasn't understood, so people simply accepted the constant itching and discomfort as part of life. Fleas were another constant companion. They lived in the rush-covered floors of the Great Hall, in the straw mattresses, and in the clothes people wore. Flea bites were so common that they were barely noticed, but fleas also carried plague, which periodically devastated castle populations. The kitchen was a special kind of hell when it came to filth and contamination. Food was prepared in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Meat was butchered on wooden tables that were rarely cleaned, and the blood and grease soaked into the wood, creating breeding grounds for bacteria. Flies swarmed around the cooking areas, landing on food that was then served to the castle's residents. Food storage was primitive and ineffective. Grain was stored in sacks that were accessible to rats and mice, and these rodents left their droppings throughout the food supply. Meat was preserved by salting or smoking, but these methods were often inadequate, and partially spoiled meat was commonly served rather than wasted. The dining situation was equally disgusting. The rush-covered floors of the Great Hall were never properly cleaned. Food scraps, spilled wine, vomit, and other waste accumulated in the rushes, creating a fetid carpet that squished underfoot. Dogs roamed freely through the dining area, eating scraps and relieving themselves wherever they pleased. Water was a constant problem. Wells were often contaminated with sewage, and there was no understanding of water purification. People drank from the same sources where they dumped their waste, creating a cycle of disease and contamination. The famous medieval preference for ale and wine over water wasn't just cultural, it was a survival mechanism. The castle's animals added another layer of filth. Horses, pigs, chickens, and dogs lived in close proximity to humans, and their waste was everywhere. The stables were rarely cleaned, and animal droppings accumulated in the courtyards. The smell of rotting manure mixed with human waste created an atmosphere so foul that it's difficult to imagine. Medical care, such as it was, took place in these same filthy conditions. When someone was injured or ill, they were treated with unwashed hands, dirty instruments, and contaminated water. Wounds were dressed with cloth that had been used for other purposes, and infections were common. The mortality rate from what we would consider minor injuries was staggering. The castle's dead presented their own sanitation challenges. Bodies were often stored in the castle for days or weeks before burial, especially in winter when the ground was frozen. The decomposition process filled the air with the sweet, sickening smell of death. Plague victims were sometimes buried in mass graves within the castle grounds, contaminating the soil and water supply. Women faced particular challenges with hygiene. Menstruation was managed with rags that were washed when possible, but more often were simply discarded or reused without proper cleaning. Childbirth took place in the same unsanitary conditions, with unwashed hands and contaminated linens. The mortality rate for both mothers and babies was astronomical. The psychological impact of living in such filth was enormous. People became accustomed to smells and conditions that would make modern humans violently ill. They developed a tolerance for discomfort that was essentially a survival mechanism. The constant itching from lice, the burning sensation from infected wounds, and the nausea from overwhelming smells became the normal background of daily life. The wealthy attempted to mask these conditions with perfumes and spices, but these provided only temporary relief. The smell of roses or lavender couldn't overcome the fundamental reality of human waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. The famous medieval practice of carrying small bouquets of flowers wasn't romantic. It was a desperate attempt to have something pleasant to smell in a world of overwhelming stench. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how this filth was simply accepted as natural and unavoidable. There was no concept of sanitation, no understanding of disease transmission, and no belief that conditions could be improved. People lived in squalor because they couldn't imagine any alternative. The contrast between the external grandeur of castles and their internal reality was stark. These impressive stone structures, built to display power and wealth, were actually monuments to human suffering and degradation. The higher the walls, the more impressive the towers, the more likely it was that the people inside were living in conditions of unimaginable filth and misery. So when you see those beautiful castle scenes in movies, remember what we've learned tonight. Behind the flowing banners and gleaming armor was a reality of human waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. The medieval castle wasn't a palace, it was a cesspit dressed up in stone, where the stench of noble living was anything but noble. Part 5. The Servants Beneath the Silence. In every castle movie, the servants are background figures, faceless people who appear with food, clean up messes, and disappear into the shadows. But here's the truth that Hollywood doesn't want you to know. These invisible people were the ones who actually kept the castle functioning, and their lives were a daily nightmare of back-breaking labor, constant fear, and systematic dehumanization. Let's talk numbers first. In a typical castle, servants outnumbered the nobility by at least 10 to 1. While the lord's family might consist of half a dozen people, the servant population could range from 50 to over 200 individuals. These weren't just kitchen maids and stable boys. They formed a complex hierarchy of specialized workers, each trapped in their own particular version of hell. At the top of the servant hierarchy was the steward, the lord's right-hand man who managed the castle's daily operations. But don't imagine this was a position of comfort or security. The steward was essentially a highly skilled slave who could be dismissed, imprisoned, or executed at the lord's whim. He was responsible for everything that went wrong, from food shortages to servant rebellions, and he lived in constant fear of making a mistake that would cost him his life. Below the steward came the specialized servants, the marshal who managed the stables, the cook who ran the kitchen, the chamberlain who handled the lord's personal needs, and the various craftsmen who kept the castle functioning. Each of these positions required years of training and carried enormous responsibility, but also enormous risk. A cook who served spoiled food might be beaten or banished. A marshal whose horse went lame might face accusations of sabotage. The kitchen staff lived in what can only be described as a medieval version of hell. The kitchen was a separate building, designed to prevent fires from spreading to the main castle. But this isolation made it a prison for those who worked there. The head cook ruled with absolute authority, wielding knives and cleavers not just for food preparation, but as weapons to maintain discipline among his subordinates. Kitchen work began before dawn and continued long after dark. The fire had to be maintained constantly, which meant someone had to tend it through the night. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, often hundreds of yards away. Food had to be prepared for dozens or hundreds of people, using primitive tools and open flames. The heat was unbearable in summer, and the smoke from the fires made breathing difficult year-round. The scullery maids had perhaps the worst job in the entire castle. They spent their days washing dishes, pots, and cooking utensils with harsh soap made from animal fat and lye. This soap burned their skin, leaving their hands cracked and bleeding. They worked in freezing water, often breaking ice to fill their washing tubs. Their hands were permanently stained and scarred from the constant contact with grease, blood, and harsh chemicals. The serving wenches who brought food to the great hall faced different but equally terrible challenges. They had to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the hall, knowing exactly who to serve first and in what order. They also had to endure constant sexual harassment from the knights and nobles, with no protection or recourse if they were assaulted. The stable hands lived with the animals, often sleeping in the same stalls as the horses they tended. They were covered in manure, hay, and horse sweat from dawn to dusk. Their job was dangerous. Horses were valuable military assets. They were kicked, bitten, and trampled regularly, and medical care was non-existent. The laundresses had one of the most physically demanding jobs in the castle. They had to haul water, heat it over fires, and then scrub clothes by hand using harsh soap. The process was so labor-intensive that clothes were washed only occasionally, and the laundress's hands were permanently damaged from the constant contact with lye and hot water. In winter, they often had to break ice to get water, and their wet clothes would freeze solid in the cold. The chamber servants who attended to the lord's family had access to better living conditions, but they paid for this privilege with their freedom and dignity. They dressed their masters, bathed them, and even helped them with their bodily functions. Privacy was non-existent. They slept in their masters' rooms and were expected to remain silent and invisible. The children who worked in the castle faced horrors that would be considered child abuse today. Boys as young as 6 or 7 were put to work carrying water, cleaning floors, and tending fires. Child mortality among the servant class was staggering. The castle's seamstresses and weavers worked in conditions that would horrify modern labor inspectors. They sat hunched over their work for 12 to 16 hours a day, often in poorly lit rooms that damaged their eyesight. The repetitive motions of spinning, weaving, and sewing caused permanent damage to their hands and backs. They were paid almost nothing and were expected to produce perfect work despite working with primitive tools and poor materials. The gong farmers, the people who cleaned the latrines, occupied the very bottom of the servant hierarchy. They were paid extra for their willingness to do work that was considered beneath even the most desperate people. They lived in isolation, shunned by other servants, and often died young from the diseases they contracted in their work. The castle's guards and men-at-arms were technically servants, but they were also potential threats to the other servants. They were often brutal men who used their weapons to maintain order among the servant population. A guard who killed a servant might face a fine, but he was unlikely to face any serious consequences. The seasonal workers who came to the castle for harvest time or special occasions faced their own unique challenges. They were outsiders who were viewed with suspicion and hostility by both the permanent servants and the nobility. They were often cheated out of their wages, and they had no protection against abuse or exploitation. Many were simply abandoned when their work was done, left to find their own way home or to starve. The punishment system for servants was brutal and arbitrary. A servant who was caught stealing food might have their hand cut off. A servant who was accused of insubordination might be flogged in public. A servant who was suspected of plotting against the Lord might be tortured until they confessed whether they were guilty or not. The sexual exploitation of female servants was systematic and accepted. Noblemen considered female servants to be their property, available for sexual use at any time. Rape was common, and pregnancy was often the result. Female servants who became pregnant were usually dismissed without pay or support, left to fend for themselves and their children. Some were forced into prostitution, while others simply died from botched attempts at abortion. The male servants weren't immune to sexual exploitation either. Young boys were often targeted by older men, both nobles and other servants. The culture of violence and dominance that pervaded castle life extended to sexual relationships, and physical strength was often the only protection against assault. The working conditions were so dangerous that accidents were commonplace. Servants were burned by fires, crushed by falling stones, poisoned by spoiled food, and injured by the animals they tended. Medical care was primitive at best, and many servants died from injuries that would be easily treatable today. The attitude toward servant safety was essentially that servants were replaceable while the work had to continue. The psychological toll of servant life was enormous. These people lived in constant fear, never knowing when they might be punished, dismissed, or killed. They had no privacy, no personal possessions, and no hope of improving their circumstances. Many developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They were jumpy, anxious, and unable to form normal relationships. The servants' quarters were overcrowded, unsanitary, and often dangerous. Multiple people were crammed into small spaces, sharing beds and breathing the same stale air. Disease spread rapidly through the servant population, and the mortality rate was much higher than among the nobility. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other respiratory diseases were common killers. Perhaps most tragically, the servant class was trapped in a cycle of poverty and exploitation that was almost impossible to escape. The skills they learned were specific to castle life, making it difficult to find work elsewhere. Even if they managed to leave, they often had to return because there were no other options available to them. The servants who kept the medieval castle functioning were not the cheerful, willing workers depicted in popular culture. They were human beings trapped in a system that valued their labor but denied their humanity. They were the invisible foundation upon which the entire feudal system was built, and their suffering was the price paid for the luxury and power of the nobility. When we look at medieval castles today, we see impressive monuments to human achievement. But we should also remember the countless servants who built those walls, cooked those meals, and cleaned those floors. They were the ones who truly made castle life possible, and their stories deserve to be told, even if they make us uncomfortable about the world they lived in. Part 6: Iron, Blood, and Etiquette. The medieval castle wasn't just a home or a fortress. It was a machine designed to generate and maintain power through systematic terror. Every aspect of castle life was engineered to remind everyone, from the highest knight to the lowest servant, that their lives hung by a thread that could be cut at any moment by the Lord's whim. What we call medieval justice was actually a carefully orchestrated system of psychological and physical torture designed to keep people in line through sheer, overwhelming fear. Let's start with the most visible symbol of this system, the gibbet. This wasn't hidden away in some dungeon. It was prominently displayed in the castle's main courtyard, where everyone had to see it every day. The gibbet was essentially a human-shaped metal cage where the bodies of executed criminals were left to rot as a warning to others. But here's what makes it truly horrifying. People were sometimes put in these cages while still alive, left to die slowly of thirst and starvation, while the entire castle population watched. The lord of the castle held the power of life and death over everyone within his domain, and this power was exercised regularly and publicly. Medieval law recognized something called high justice, the right to execute people, and lords used this right not just to punish crimes, but to maintain psychological control over their subjects. The execution methods were deliberately brutal and public, designed to terrorize witnesses into submission. Hanging was considered the merciful option. The condemned person was dragged to the gallows, usually located in full view of the Great Hall, and strangled to death while the entire household watched. But hanging was reserved for common criminals, those accused of treason, rebellion, or other crimes against the Lord faced far worse fates. Drawing and quartering was the ultimate punishment, reserved for the most serious offenses. The condemned person was tied to horses and literally torn apart, their body parts displayed throughout the castle as a warning. But even this wasn't the end. The victim was often kept alive through most of the process, forced to watch their own dismemberment before finally dying. The castle's dungeon wasn't just a prison. It was a torture chamber where the Lord's enemies were broken, both physically and psychologically. The most common form of torture was the rack, a device that slowly stretched the victim's body until their joints dislocated and their muscles tore. The victim was kept conscious throughout the process, and the torture could continue for days or even weeks. But the rack was just one tool in an arsenal of devices designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim alive. The Iron Maiden was a coffin-like box lined with spikes that penetrated the victim's body without hitting vital organs. The thumbscrew crushed fingers and toes, while the breaking wheel shattered bones systematically. The brazen bull was a bronze torture device shaped like a bull, where victims were locked inside and roasted alive over a fire. The most insidious aspect of this system was how it turned ordinary people into instruments of terror. Servants were forced to watch executions and tortures, and they were expected to participate in the rituals of punishment. A servant who refused to watch an execution might be accused of sympathy for the condemned and face punishment themselves. The castle's courtroom was a theater of cruelty, where the outcome was usually predetermined. The Lord served as judge, jury, and executioner, and there was no such thing as due process or the presumption of innocence. Trials were brief affairs where the accused was expected to confess their guilt and beg for mercy. Those who maintained their innocence were often tortured until they confessed. The medieval concept of trial by ordeal was particularly brutal. The accused might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar, walk across burning coals, or be thrown into water while bound. If they survived without permanent injury, they were considered innocent. If they were burned, scarred, or drowned, they were guilty. This system guaranteed that most people accused of crimes would be found guilty, regardless of their actual innocence. Women faced particular horrors in the castle's justice system. Accused witches were subjected to tests that were designed to prove their guilt. The water test involved binding the woman and throwing her into a body of water. If she floated, she was a witch and would be burned alive. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent. The pin test involved searching for devil's marks on the woman's body by stabbing her with pins until she failed to feel pain, which was considered proof of supernatural powers. The sexual violence inherent in the castle's power structure was institutionalized through the concept of droit du seigneur, the Lord's right to sleep with any woman in his domain on her wedding night. This wasn't just a privilege, it was a demonstration of absolute power over the most intimate aspects of people's lives. Women who refused could face charges of treason, while their husbands could be accused of interfering with the Lord's rights. Children weren't exempt from the castle's system of terror. Young boys who were caught stealing food might have their hands cut off. Girls who were accused of promiscuity might be branded on their faces. The Lord's own children were raised in this atmosphere of violence and learned to see brutality as normal and necessary. The punishment system extended beyond formal executions and torture to include everyday brutality that was considered routine. Servants were regularly beaten for minor infractions, and these beatings were often public spectacles designed to terrorize other workers. A cook who burned the Lord's meal might be forced to eat burning coals. A servant who was caught sleeping on duty might be branded with a hot iron. The castle's guards and men-at-arms were both enforcers and victims of this system. They were expected to carry out the Lord's violent orders without question. But they also lived in constant fear of being accused of disloyalty or incompetence. A guard who failed to prevent a crime might face the same punishment as the criminal. A knight who showed mercy to an enemy might be accused of treason. The psychological impact of living in this atmosphere of constant terror was devastating. People became paranoid, suspicious, and willing to betray friends and family members to avoid punishment themselves. Children grew up believing that violence was the natural order of things, and they learned to suppress any sense of compassion or empathy. The Lord's absolute power corrupted not just the system, but the people who wielded it. Many lords became sadistic monsters who enjoyed inflicting pain and suffering on their subjects. They would invent new and creative punishments, often competing with other lords to see who could devise the most cruel and unusual tortures. The suffering of their subjects became a form of entertainment. The religious justification for this system of terror was provided by the castle's chaplain, who preached that the Lord's power came directly from God, and that resistance to the Lord's will was a sin against divine authority. The chapel became another tool of control, where people were told that their suffering was part of God's plan, and that they should accept their fate with resignation. The economic aspect of the punishment system was equally brutal. People accused of crimes had their property confiscated, regardless of their guilt or innocence. Families could be reduced to starvation overnight if the breadwinner was accused of wrongdoing. The threat of financial ruin was often more effective than the threat of physical punishment in maintaining control. The castle's system of informants and spies meant that privacy was non-existent. Servants were encouraged to report on each other, and children were taught to inform on their parents. The Lord maintained detailed records of everyone's activities, looking for signs of disloyalty or rebellion. People learned to watch their words and actions constantly, never knowing who might be listening or reporting. The arbitrariness of the punishment system was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. People could be accused and convicted of crimes they didn't commit based on the testimony of enemies or the whims of the Lord. There was no appeal process, no higher authority to turn to, and no hope of justice. The only protection was to remain completely submissive and hope that someone else would become the target of the Lord's wrath. The long-term effects of this system extended far beyond the castle walls. Children who grew up in this environment of violence and terror often became violent themselves, perpetuating the cycle of brutality. The normalization of extreme violence created a society where human life had little value and where might truly did make right. The medieval castle's system of justice wasn't about maintaining order or protecting the innocent. It was about maintaining power through fear. Every public execution, every torture session, every arbitrary punishment was a message to the castle's inhabitants: submit completely or face consequences that were literally worse than death. The iron fist of medieval justice didn't just punish the guilty, it terrorized the innocent into absolute obedience. When we look at medieval castles today, we see impressive architecture and romantic history. But we should also remember the screams that echoed from the torture chambers, the bodies that rotted in the gibbets, and the tears of children who learned that violence was the only language their world understood. The stone walls that seemed so solid and permanent were built not just to keep enemies out, but to keep terror in. Part 7. Walls built for war. The medieval castle wasn't built for comfortable living. It was built for one purpose: to survive a siege. And when those walls were put to their ultimate test, when enemy armies surrounded the castle and settled in for a long, brutal siege, the people trapped inside discovered that their stone fortress could become their stone tomb. A siege wasn't a quick battle that lasted a few days. It was a slow, methodical process of starvation, disease, and psychological warfare that could drag on for months or even years. The attacking army didn't need to break down the walls. They just needed to wait for the people inside to die of hunger, thirst, or madness. Let's start with the brutal mathematics of siege warfare. A castle that could comfortably house 50 people might find itself defending against an army of thousands. But when word came that enemies were approaching, the castle's population would swell dramatically. Peasants from the surrounding countryside would flee to the castle for protection, bringing their families, their livestock, and whatever food they could carry. Suddenly, the castle might have to sustain 200 or 300 people with supplies that were meant for 50. The first sign of an approaching siege was the smoke on the horizon, not from campfires, but from burning villages. The attacking army would systematically destroy everything in the surrounding area, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and poisoning wells. This wasn't just military strategy. It was psychological warfare designed to tell the people in the castle that there would be no rescue, no relief, and no hope. When the enemy army finally arrived and encircled the castle, the real horror began. The castle's gates were barred and wouldn't be opened again until the siege was over, one way or another. The people inside were trapped, cut off from the outside world, living on whatever food and water they had managed to store before the siege began. The food situation became desperate almost immediately. Medieval food preservation was primitive, and most perishable items would spoil within days. The castle's inhabitants would watch helplessly as their fresh meat rotted, their vegetables went bad, and their bread became moldy. What had seemed like adequate supplies for a month might last only a week when stretched among hundreds of people. The hierarchy that governed castle life became even more rigid during a siege. The lord and his family continued to eat relatively well, while the servants and refugees were given smaller and smaller rations. As the siege dragged on, the food distribution became a daily reminder of who had power and who didn't. The lord might still be eating meat, while his servants were reduced to eating boiled leather and tree bark. Water was often more critical than food. Many castles had wells, but these could be poisoned by the enemy, or might simply run dry under the increased demand. The besieging army would often try to cut off the castle's water supply by diverting streams or contaminating wells. Some castles had elaborate systems of cisterns and channels to collect rainwater, but these could be sabotaged or might prove inadequate. The psychological toll of the siege was enormous. People who had lived their entire lives within the castle's walls suddenly found those same walls transformed from protection into prison bars. There was no escape, no relief, and no privacy. Hundreds of people were crammed into spaces designed for dozens, with no sanitation facilities adequate for the population. The castle's defenders had to maintain constant vigilance. The walls had to be manned 24 hours a day, with guards watching for any sign of enemy activity. But as the siege continued and malnutrition set in, the guards became weak and unreliable. Men who had once been strong warriors were reduced to scarecrows, barely able to hold their weapons. The enemy army didn't just wait passively for the castle to surrender. They employed a variety of siege engines and tactics designed to break down the walls or terrorize the defenders. Catapults hurled massive stones at the walls, while trebuchets launched diseased corpses, severed heads, and other psychological weapons into the castle courtyard. The most terrifying siege weapon was Greek fire, a primitive form of napalm that burned on water and was nearly impossible to extinguish. When Greek fire landed in the castle courtyard, it would burn for hours, filling the air with toxic smoke and creating an inferno that could spread to the wooden structures within the walls. Mining was another siege tactic that created constant terror for the defenders. The enemy would dig tunnels under the castle walls, then collapse them to create breaches. The defenders would try to countermine, digging their own tunnels to intercept the enemy miners. These underground battles were fought in complete darkness, with men struggling hand-to-hand in cramped tunnels that could collapse at any moment. The castle's children suffered terribly during sieges. There was no school, no play, and no childhood innocence. Children as young as 5 or 6 were put to work carrying water, tending the wounded, and helping with the defense. Many children died of malnutrition, disease, or injuries sustained during enemy attacks. Disease was often more deadly than enemy weapons. The overcrowded, unsanitary conditions were perfect breeding grounds for plague, typhus, and other infectious diseases. When disease broke out in a besieged castle, it could kill more people in a week than the enemy army could kill in a month. The dead had to be buried quickly, often in mass graves within the castle walls, further contaminating the water supply. The castle's animals suffered alongside the humans. Horses, cattle, and other livestock were slaughtered for food as the siege dragged on. The castle's dogs and cats were often eaten as well, and toward the end of a long siege, people might resort to eating rats, mice, and even insects. The stench of death and decay filled the air as both humans and animals died, and their bodies couldn't be properly disposed of. They were responsible for nursing the wounded, caring for the sick, and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life for the children. But they also faced the constant threat of rape and murder if the castle fell. Many women carried knives, not to fight the enemy, but to kill themselves and their children, rather than face capture. Torture prisoners within sight of the castle walls, and use loud noises and bright lights to prevent the defenders from sleeping. The constant stress and fear drove many people to madness. The Lord's authority was challenged by hungry, desperate people who had nothing left to lose. Some servants attempted to escape by climbing down the castle walls at night, but most were caught and killed by the enemy. They might attempt sorties, sudden attacks designed to break through the enemy lines, but these efforts were usually futile, and they often resulted in the deaths of the castle's best warriors. When even the rats had been consumed, people turned to the ultimate taboo. The dead were butchered like animals, their flesh cooked and eaten by the living. Parents ate their children, children ate their parents, and all semblance of humanity was stripped away by the simple need to survive. And the political calculations often favored letting the besieged castle fall. Surrender was often not an option, as the enemy might not accept it or might demand terms that were worse than death. The attacking army would often massacre the survivors, rape the women, and loot whatever remained. The castle itself might be partially destroyed to prevent it from being used again. The siege was over, but the suffering of those who had endured it was just beginning. They had seen their friends and families die of starvation, disease, and violence. They had been reduced to eating human flesh and drinking their own urine. They had witnessed the complete breakdown of civilization and the triumph of the most primitive survival instincts. The castle walls that had seemed so strong and protective had become the boundaries of a nightmare. The people who had sought safety behind those walls had found instead a slow, agonizing death. The siege had turned their fortress into a tomb, and the survivors would carry the memory of those stone walls and what had happened within them for the rest of their lives. They saw people reduced to animals, families destroyed by hunger and disease, and entire communities erased from existence. The stones that seemed so solid and permanent were built to protect life, but they often became monuments to death, starvation, and the ultimate failure of human civilization. Part 8. The plague behind the portcullis. The first symptom wasn't the black swellings that gave the plague its name. It was the silence. In a castle where even whispers echoed through stone corridors, the sudden absence of sound was deafening. No clatter of servants' feet on stairs, no scraping of chairs in the great hall, no children's laughter from the solar, just the wind through arrow slits, carrying with it the sweet, cloying smell of death. When plague struck a medieval castle, those mighty walls that were meant to keep enemies out became a prison. Unlike a village where the sick could be abandoned to die in fields, a castle was a closed system. Every breath was shared, every surface touched by dozens of hands. The very architecture that made castles defensible made them death traps when disease took hold. The medical knowledge of the time was a dangerous mixture of classical theory, religious doctrine, and desperate superstition. Castle physicians believed illness was caused by miasma, bad air that corrupted the blood. They would burn aromatic herbs in braziers, filling chambers with smoke that made breathing even more difficult for the sick. They prescribed bloodletting to balance the humors, weakening patients who were already dying. They consulted astrological charts to determine the best time for treatment, often delaying care for days while people suffered. But it wasn't just plague that haunted castle walls. Medieval life was a constant battle against infection and injury. A simple cut from a kitchen knife could fester and kill within days. Broken bones, set without proper knowledge, left people crippled for life. Women died in childbirth with horrifying regularity, even noble ladies with the best care available. The castle's lady might have 5 or 6 children, knowing that perhaps half would survive to adulthood. the everyday reality of medieval medicine was brutal. Surgery was performed without anesthesia. Patients held down by servants, while barber surgeons cut into flesh with unwashed instruments. The screams would echo through the castle for hours. Amputations were common. A festering limb was removed with a saw. The wound cauterized with a red-hot iron. The smell of burning flesh and the patient's agonized cries became part of the castle's dark symphony. Dental care was virtually non-existent. Even wealthy nobles suffered from rotting teeth, abscesses, and constant pain. A castle lord might command armies and rule over thousands, but he could be brought to his knees by a toothache. When teeth were extracted, it was done without pain relief, often by blacksmiths who had the strongest grip and the sharpest tools. Mental illness was perhaps the most terrifying affliction of all. In an age that believed madness was caused by demons or divine punishment, the mentally ill were often chained in cellars or towers. They were fed scraps like animals, left to waste away in their own filth. Some castles had madhouse chambers where the afflicted were kept out of sight, their cries adding to the ghostly sounds that echoed through the walls at night. The castle's response to death was as much about politics as grief. When a lord died, his body had to be preserved for the funeral procession that would legitimize his heir's claim. In winter, this was easier. The body could be kept in a cold chamber, but in summer, the corpse would be covered in salt, wrapped in expensive spices, and sealed in lead coffins. Superstition ruled every aspect of medical care. Unicorn horns were ground into powder and mixed with wine to cure poison. Bezoar stones, formed in the stomachs of animals, were believed to neutralize any toxin. The wealthy would pay fortunes for these supposed remedies, often dying while clutching worthless talismans. The castle's religious response to illness was equally disturbing. Priests would perform exorcisms on the sick, believing that demons had possessed the patient. They would force holy water down the throats of the dying, sometimes drowning them in their zeal to save souls. Relics were brought to bedsides, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, vials of holy blood. Children in castles lived in constant danger. Infant mortality was so high that many weren't named until they survived their first year. Those who lived faced a gauntlet of diseases that would kill them before adolescence. Smallpox left survivors scarred and sometimes blind. Measles, mumps, and whooping cough swept through castle nurseries like wildfire. The wealthy could afford wet nurses, but this often meant that poor women's own children died of starvation while they fed noble babies. The psychological impact of living surrounded by death cannot be overstated. Castle dwellers developed a fatalistic worldview where suffering was expected and death was always near. They lived with the knowledge that a minor injury could be fatal, that a cold could turn into consumption, that tomorrow might bring plague to their door. This constant awareness of mortality shaped every aspect of medieval life. Even bathing, one of life's basic necessities, was fraught with danger. Medieval people weren't as dirty as stereotypes suggest, but they were terrified of water. They believed that bathing opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. When they did bathe, it was often in shared tubs where infections spread rapidly. The wealthy might bathe monthly, the poor perhaps never. The castle's food storage areas were breeding grounds for disease. Meat was preserved in salt, but often spoiled anyway. Grain was stored in damp cellars where it grew moldy and toxic. The very act of eating was dangerous. Ergot poisoning from contaminated rye caused hallucinations and death. Lead poisoning from pewter dishes and wine vessels caused madness and paralysis among the nobility. When epidemics struck, the castle's social hierarchy crumbled. Lords and ladies died alongside their servants, their wealth and status offering no protection against disease. The survivors were left to dispose of bodies, often throwing them into castle wells or burying them in mass graves within the walls. These unsanitary practices ensured that disease would return again and again. The most haunting aspect of medieval castle life was how death became normalized. Children grew up seeing corpses, hearing death rattles, witnessing the agony of the dying. They learned to accept that most people they knew would die young, often in terrible pain. This acceptance of mortality created a culture where life was cheap and suffering was expected. The castle walls that were meant to provide safety became monuments to human suffering. Behind every stone was a story of pain, loss, and desperate hope. The dream of chivalric romance dissolves when confronted with the reality of medieval medicine, a world where cure was often worse than disease, where superstition trumped science, and where the shadow of death hung over every moment of life. Part 9. Whispers in the Chapel. The castle chapel was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where souls found peace and spirits were comforted. But in the flickering candlelight, shadows danced across stone walls like demons, and the very air seemed thick with the weight of centuries of desperate prayers. The chapel wasn't just a house of worship, it was a theater of spiritual terror, where the living grappled with forces they couldn't understand, and the dead refused to rest. Medieval Christianity was not the gentle, forgiving faith many imagine today. It was a religion of fear, built on the terrifying certainty that demons lurked in every shadow, and that salvation hung by the thinnest of threads. The castle chapel, with its cold stone walls and blood-red stained glass, reflected this harsh theology. Here, God was not a loving father, but a stern judge, quick to punish and slow to forgive. The chapel's architecture itself was designed to inspire awe and dread. Pointed arches stretched toward heaven like grasping fingers, while gargoyles perched on windowsills seemed to watch the congregation with malevolent eyes. The altar was often built over a relic, a fragment of a saint's bone or a piece of the true cross, and the very ground beneath the worshippers' feet was considered sacred and cursed in equal measure. Every castle had its collection of ghostly tales, and the chapel was often their epicenter. The spirit of a knight who had died in battle might appear during midnight prayers, his armor clanking as he walked the aisle. A lady who had died in childbirth might be seen weeping at the altar, her ghostly cries echoing through the vaulted ceiling. Children who had died of plague might be glimpsed in the candlelight, their pale faces turned toward the cross in eternal supplication. These weren't just stories told to frighten children. Castle inhabitants genuinely believed their dead remained trapped within the walls, unable to find peace. The chapel became a liminal space where the living and the dead coexisted, where prayers for the departed mixed with terror of their return. Midnight masses were particularly feared, the hour when the veil between worlds was thinnest, when the dead might rise to reclaim their earthly ties. The cult of relics added another layer of spiritual dread to chapel life. Medieval people believed that fragments of saints' bodies retained miraculous power, but these holy objects were also sources of superstitious terror. A finger bone of St. Thomas might cure the sick, but it might also bring divine wrath if handled improperly. A piece of Christ's cross could grant salvation, but it demanded absolute reverence and perfect faith. Castle chapels housed collections of these relics that would seem bizarre to modern sensibilities. Vials of the Virgin Mary's milk, fragments of the manger, thorns from Christ's crown. All were displayed in elaborate reliquaries that caught the candlelight like jeweled eyes. But alongside these Christian relics were older, darker objects, pagan amulets that had been blessed by priests, ancient stones believed to ward off evil, and mysterious artifacts whose origins were lost to time. The chapel's priest was often a figure of both reverence and suspicion. While he offered spiritual guidance and performed the sacred rituals, he was also the keeper of the castle's darkest secrets. He heard confessions that revealed murders, adulteries, and betrayals. He performed exorcisms on the possessed, wrestling with demons in the very space where families came to pray. His knowledge of Latin made him seem otherworldly to the illiterate masses, as if he spoke directly to God and the devil alike. Medieval Christianity was obsessed with the concept of purgatory, a realm where souls suffered to purge their sins before ascending to heaven. The chapel was often used for masses for the dead, lengthy services designed to reduce the time souls spent in purgatorial flames. These masses could last for hours, with the congregation kneeling on cold stone floors while the priest chanted in Latin, calling on God's mercy for the departed. But the most terrifying aspect of chapel life was the belief in demonic possession. Medieval people were convinced that demons could invade human bodies, turning the possessed into instruments of evil. Exorcisms were performed regularly in castle chapels, with priests commanding unclean spirits to depart while the possessed writhed and screamed. The congregation would huddle in pews, praying desperately while witnessing what they believed was a literal battle between good and evil. The chapel's calendar was filled with observances that mixed Christian doctrine with pagan tradition. All Saints' Day, when the dead were believed to walk among the living, was both a holy day and a night of terror. The congregation would light candles for the departed while fearing their return. Christmas was celebrated with joy, but also with the knowledge that the winter solstice had always been a time when dark forces held sway. Children in castle chapels were exposed to imagery that would traumatize modern audiences. Stained glass windows depicted the torments of hell in vivid detail, demons with pitchforks, souls burning in eternal flames, the damned suffering punishments that matched their earthly sins. These images were meant to inspire piety, but they also filled young minds with nightmares that would last a lifetime. The chapel's role in castle justice added another dimension of fear. It was here that accused criminals might claim sanctuary, clutching the altar while their pursuers waited outside. It was here that oaths were sworn on holy relics, with the understanding that breaking such vows would bring divine punishment. The chapel witnessed confessions extracted under torture, forced marriages, and the blessing of weapons destined for war. Medieval people believed that churches and chapels were literally under siege by demonic forces. They would sprinkle holy water on the walls, bury blessed objects in the foundation, and perform rituals to protect the sacred space from evil. But these very precautions suggested that the chapel was not safe, that even in God's house, darkness could find a foothold. The music that filled the chapel was itself a source of spiritual anxiety. Gregorian chant, with its haunting melodies and Latin lyrics, was believed to have the power to raise the dead or summon angels. But it could also attract darker entities, drawn by the sound of human voices raised in desperate prayer. The chapel's acoustics, designed to amplify the priest's voice, also magnified every whisper, every sob, every ghostly sound that echoed through the stone. Perhaps most disturbing was the chapel's connection to the castle's most violent moments. It was here that dying knights received last rites, their blood staining the altar steps. It was here that plague victims were brought for final prayers, their diseased bodies contaminating the sacred space. It was here that murderers sought absolution, confessing their crimes, while the victims' families knelt nearby, praying for justice or revenge. The chapel's night hours were particularly feared. After the evening service, when the congregation had departed and the priest had withdrawn to his chambers, the chapel became a realm of shadows and whispers. Guards on duty would report hearing phantom chanting, seeing figures moving in the darkness, feeling the presence of unseen watchers. Some refused to patrol near the chapel after dark, preferring to face earthly enemies rather than supernatural ones. The most chilling aspect of chapel life was the belief that God himself might be absent. Medieval theology acknowledged that there were times when heaven seemed silent, when prayers went unanswered, when evil appeared to triumph. In these moments, the chapel became not a sanctuary but a tomb, its cold stones offering no comfort to the desperate souls seeking salvation. The reality of medieval spiritual life was far removed from the peaceful worship we might imagine. In the castle chapel, faith was a battle fought in darkness against enemies, both seen and unseen. The whispers that echoed through those sacred spaces were not just prayers, but cries of terror from souls who knew that salvation was not guaranteed, that the divine was as likely to punish as to protect, and that the dead were never truly at rest. Chapter 10: The Legacy of the Walls. As dawn breaks over the ruins of medieval castles today, tourists wander through chambers that once echoed with screams, their cameras capturing beauty where terror once reigned. The crumbling walls have become romantic backdrops for weddings, the very stones that witnessed centuries of suffering now serving as props for fairy tale fantasies. But the true legacy of these walls is not the chivalric romance we've been sold. It's a testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable hardship. The transformation of medieval castles from instruments of oppression into symbols of romance is one of history's most successful marketing campaigns. It began in the 18th and 19th centuries, when romantic writers and artists, safely removed from medieval reality, began to reimagine castle life as a golden age of honor and courtly love. They painted pictures of noble knights and fair ladies, of tournaments and troubadours, of a world where virtue always triumphed and love conquered all. This romanticization was deliberately constructed to obscure the brutal truth. Victorian scholars, uncomfortable with the violence and squalor of medieval life, chose to emphasize the few surviving examples of chivalric literature while ignoring the countless records of suffering. They focused on the Arthurian legends, the songs of courtly love, the illuminated manuscripts that depicted an idealized world that never existed for the vast majority of people. The reality they chose to ignore was documented in the very stones they admired. Archaeological evidence tells a different story of malnutrition so severe that it stunted growth, of diseases that left their mark on every skeleton, of violence so common that nearly every adult male showed signs of healed battle wounds. The castle walls that seem so picturesque today were built by peasants who died in their construction, mortared with the sweat and blood of generations who knew nothing of the romance later attributed to their suffering. Medieval manuscripts, the very sources used to create the chivalric myth, reveal a different truth when read carefully. Between the lines of courtly romances are glimpses of a world where rape was commonplace, where children were commodities to be traded, where the weak were crushed without mercy. The knights celebrated in literature were often little more than armed thugs. Their chivalry, a thin veneer over brutal pragmatism. The castle walls themselves bear witness to this reality. Scratch marks in dungeon stones tell of prisoners who clawed at their confines until their fingers bled. Burn marks on chamber walls record the fires that claimed lives when warfare came to the gates. The very architecture speaks of a society obsessed with defense because violence was the norm, not the exception. But perhaps the most damning legacy of the walls is what they represent: a system built on the suffering of the many to benefit the few. Every stone was cut by peasants who lived in hovels. Every wall was raised by workers who would never know the comfort of the chambers they built. The castle was a monument to inequality, a physical manifestation of a social order that treated human beings as expendable resources. The myths that grew around castle life served a purpose beyond mere entertainment. They justified the existing social order by presenting feudalism as a romantic ideal rather than a system of exploitation, by teaching people to admire the good old days of lords and ladies. The powerful could distract from the reality that the common people had always been oppressed, that their suffering was not new but had deep historical roots. Modern castle tourism continues this tradition of willful blindness. Visitors are shown the great halls and solar chambers, the pretty parts of castle life, while the dungeons and servants' quarters are glossed over or ignored entirely. Tour guides speak of medieval life as if everyone lived like nobility, erasing the experiences of the 99% who served as the foundation for aristocratic comfort. The truth is preserved in unexpected places. Medical records from medieval hospitals reveal the constant struggle against disease and injury. Legal documents record the endless cycle of violence and revenge that characterized daily life. Agricultural records show the precarious existence of peasants who lived one bad harvest away from starvation. These sources paint a picture of life that was, in Thomas Hobbes' famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. But the most powerful legacy of the walls is not in the stones themselves, but in the stories they chose not to tell. The names of the peasants who built them are forgotten, but the lords who lived in them are remembered. The suffering of the many is erased, while the comfort of the few is celebrated. This selective memory shapes how we understand our past and, by extension, our present. The castle walls that remain today are palimpsests, their original meaning obscured by layers of later interpretation. Renaissance nobles added comfortable apartments to medieval fortresses, softening their harsh lines. Victorian restorers rebuilt ruins according to romantic fantasies rather than historical accuracy. Modern conservation efforts focus on preserving the beauty of decay rather than confronting the reality of what these structures represented. The ghosts that supposedly haunt these walls are not the spirits of the dead, but the echoes of forgotten truths. The real haunting is not supernatural, but historical. The way we've allowed myth to obscure reality, romance to mask brutality, and selective memory to erase the suffering of countless human beings. The walls don't need to be inhabited by spirits to be haunted. They are haunted by the weight of unacknowledged history. Contemporary castle enthusiasts often speak of feeling a connection to medieval life, but this connection is based on fantasy rather than fact. They imagine themselves as nobles rather than peasants, as knights rather than victims, as participants in romance rather than witnesses to horror. This willful misidentification allows them to enjoy the aesthetics of medieval life while avoiding its moral implications. The architectural legacy of castles extends beyond their physical remains. The idea of the castle, the fortified home, the symbol of power, the romantic retreat, continues to influence how we think about security, status, and society. Modern gated communities echo the exclusivity of medieval castles, while luxury resorts trade on the romantic imagery of castle life. The very concept of the home as a castle reflects the medieval understanding of life as a constant battle against hostile forces. But the most important legacy of the walls is the lesson they teach about the power of narrative. The same stones that witnessed unspeakable suffering have been transformed into symbols of romance and beauty. This transformation shows how history is not just what happened, but what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it. The castle walls remind us that the past is not fixed, but constantly reinterpreted, that myth can be more powerful than truth, and that those who control the narrative control the meaning of history. The real tragedy of the walls is not that they are crumbling, but that they have been stripped of their true meaning. They have become pretty ruins rather than monuments to human suffering, tourist attractions rather than reminders of systemic oppression. In transforming these symbols of brutality into objects of beauty, we have lost the opportunity to learn from the past and to understand how power operates in any society. The legacy of the walls is ultimately a warning about the seductive power of myth and the danger of forgetting uncomfortable truths. As we walk through these ruins, admiring their beauty and imagining their romance, we must remember that they were built on foundations of suffering, that their beauty was purchased with blood, and that their legacy is not the chivalric ideal we've been taught to admire, but the human cost of inequality and oppression. The walls will continue to crumble, but their most important legacy, the lesson about how power operates and how history is constructed, will endure. In understanding the true nature of castle life, we gain insight not just into the medieval past, but into the mechanisms of power and myth that continue to shape our world today. This has been another journey into the shadows of history with your No Sleep historian. Remember, the past is not always what it seems, and the most beautiful stories often hide the darkest truths. Sleep well, knowing that the walls that once trapped our ancestors have crumbled, but the lessons they teach about power, suffering, and the human condition remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. Until next time, keep questioning what you've been told about the past, because the real story is always more complex, more troubling, and more important than the myths we've been fed.